Good evening. I am calling the Monday, November 16th, 2020 Parks and Natural Resources Commission meeting to order at 6:30 p.m. Tonight's meeting will be held virtually using Zoom and in person while following social distancing guidelines. As the chair, I'll be leading the Parks and Natural Resources Commission meeting, and the public is welcome to participate when invited throughout the meeting. Many members of the public may be able to attend the meeting in person or join via online Zoom. If attendees experience audio problems, we suggest you leave the meeting and then rejoin. This usually fixes the problem. Additional instructions on how to participate are posted online at burnsvillemn.gov in the public meeting calendar. As usual, tonight's meeting is available for viewing on BCTV and on the city's website. If you're unable to participate this evening and would like to submit public testimony, I encourage you to email your comments to city staff or mail your comments directly to City Hall. You may also participate in the meeting tonight by going to zoom.us/join and typing in meeting ID 972-8044-0022. Once you are logged into the meeting, please use the chat feature to tell the moderator which item you wish to speak to. You may also call into the meeting at 651-372-8299. For each public hearing, I will open up a time when callers may speak to that item and will give more instructions at that time. Your call will be muted until that time. Please note that there may be a slight delay due to the differences in technology. If speaking by phone, please mute your computer since there may be a delay. And now we can move on to the agenda. So the first item is adoption of the agenda. Anybody wish to make any changes to the agenda? Staff, any changes?
Nothing from staff.
All right, would anybody like to make a motion for adoption?
So moved.
All right, thank you, Nelson.
I'll second.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so let's do a roll call. Staff, can you assist?
Commissioner Angara.
Aye.
Commissioner Arnold.
Aye.
Commissioner Cleveland.
Aye.
Commissioner Donaldson is absent. Commissioner Fitchett.
Aye.
Chair Newman.
Aye.
And Vice Chair Woolman.
Aye. All right, so moved. And now on to our second item of the agenda. We have the August 17th, 2020 Parks and Natural Resources Commission meeting minutes. Are there any changes to the minutes that we have? All right, staff, any changes?
Nothing from staff.
All right, can I have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Second. All right, thank you very much. JJ, can we have a roll call tonight?
Yes, Commissioner Angara.
Aye.
Commissioner Arnold.
Aye.
Commissioner Cleveland.
Aye.
Commissioner Fitchett.
Aye.
Commissioner Newman.
Aye.
And Commissioner Woolman.
All right, and so moved. The minutes have passed. And now on to citizen comments. Are there any members of the public on the Zoom meeting who wish to speak? Looks like we might have one. I'm seeing that Gary's on. Is that Gary Donaldson maybe?
Yep.
All right. Hi, Gary.
Aye.
All right, but no citizens' comments on the Zoom chat, is that correct? All right, any telephone callers that might be interested in providing citizen comments tonight? You can press *6 to unmute yourselves. All right, and we don't have anybody joining us here in the room, so we're going to move on to our next agenda topic, which is reviewing findings of Keller Lake Use Attainability Report and Adjustment to the Keller Lake Water Clarity Goal. And I believe we have Greg Wilson with us to present the information. Hi, Greg.
Yeah, good evening. And thank you for allowing me to speak tonight to the commission. If somebody could pull up the slides that were sent, I think, by Caleb. If you can add that. Otherwise, I don't know if I can share my screen too, but. There it is.
Should be up now.
Okay. All right, yeah, so tonight I'm talking about the Keller Lake Use Attainability Analysis, which was prepared just earlier this year on behalf of the city of Burnsville by Bar Engineering Company. And if you want to advance it to the next slide, I can give you an outline of what I hope to cover here tonight. Give you a little bit of background and purpose for the project that we worked on earlier. Talk more specifically about the sources of phosphorus that were present both in the lake and in the Keller Lake watershed. Talk about lake water quality standards that the state of Minnesota has for a shallow lake like Keller Lake, as well as the city goals and so associated water quality goals that the city has that correspond with those standards that the state has. And the state, in this case, I'm referring to them as the MPCA, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And so they, as a result of those standards, they have already written a report that was issued a little more than 5 years ago now that talked about controlling phosphorus that is entering Keller Lake and the impacts that has on the uses of the lake. So this is what we're referring to in use attainability analysis, is what kind of uses current lake water quality support, and then what kind, if we make improvements in the level of phosphorus coming into the lake, what kinds of uses will the lake support in the future if we can improve the situation in the watershed. And so all of that ultimately ties in with lake water clarity. And so the city already has a goal of 1.8 meters, less than 6 feet of transparency. So if you're in a boat and you're looking into the water, ideally you would see down into the water about 6 feet. Or if I'm standing, I'm about 6 feet tall. If I'm standing there, I can see my feet when I'm in the water up to my neck. So that is the city's goal as of right now. We were asked to revisit that goal and then compare that to the state standard, which is actually 1.1 meter even, and so a little more than 3 feet of transparency is what the MPCA would ideally have in a lake throughout the summer period on average. And so I will just clarify up front that when the city established its goal for water clarity in Keller Lake, at that time there was an iron dosing system being run that that was treating lake water from Crystal Lake with iron dosing system before it was injected into Keller Lake. And so at that time, lake clarity was fairly good, and I'll show you some of the information about that and how that has changed over the years. So if somebody would advance to the next slide. Like I said before, one of the, I guess if you could go back one slide. So just want to give you some more background on the project and what we intended to do here with the use attainability analysis. There's a report that's in draft form right now, and it summarizes the historical lake water quality. We've done some watershed and lake water quality modeling, and then we've reported on the results of that, including how well we're achieving the water clarity goal that the city has, and summarizing any feedback we've received. We had one other meeting with the lake homeowners or any other stakeholders that lived in that area and were familiar with lake water quality of Keller Lake and how that compares to their expectations for a shallow lake like Keller Lake. And then what we've also done is we looked at the projects that have been implemented to reduce phosphorus and its impact on meeting that clarity goal. So like I said, we had that one other meeting, we invited the lake residents, and we've summarized their feedback as well. And then if you could go to the next slide. I mentioned phosphorus is the key here, and so there's really, what's happening is excess phosphorus. Right now, phosphorus is the limiting nutrient for algae growth in shallow lakes like Keller Lake. And so that algal growth can eventually form algal blooms. And so these are as the picture on the left here shows you, as you're dipping a Secchi disc into the water, and what you can start to see is almost right away that disc will start to disappear because there are these clouds of algal blooms that we refer to them as algal blooms that really start to distinguish how well you can see far down into the water because they are thick enough and growing enough and they're fed by phosphorus so that it decreases the water clarity. Ultimately, what will happen is during the course of the summer is that algae will die off. It will start to decay, it'll settle to the bottom, and then bacteria, when they go to transform that algae, they are using up dissolved oxygen near the lake bottom to decay that algae after it has died off. So the picture in the bottom right shows what we're trying to do is try to get water quality that's more like what you see on the left, in the vial on the left side, whereas when we've started most of this work, water clarity has been more like you see on the right-hand side. So if we can reduce algae in the water, we can reduce reduce phosphorus in the water, we can reduce the algae growth, and so that the samples that we're collecting look more like the picture on the left. And so that is ideal. That is really this use that we're trying to support is that ability to be able to see into the water. We want to support some plant growth so that we've got a good habitat for fish as well as other aquatic life. If you will advance to the next slide. So we have two main sources, two major places where phosphorus is coming from right now. In the Keller Lake watershed, it's primarily runoff from hard surfaces. We've got our impervious streets, driveways, parking lots. Anything that falls on those surfaces will run off, go into a gutter system and a storm sewer system that delivers stormwater into Keller Lake. It's coming from both the cities of Burnsville and the city of Apple Valley. Grass clippings, leaves, fertilizer are sources of phosphorus. When they decay, they will release soluble forms of phosphorus that algae can use. Animal waste, pet waste are also a good source of phosphorus, as well as soil erosion. And so that's what's running off into the lake. Other sources of phosphorus that are already in the lake include internal sources, and what this primarily is it's phosphorus that's already in the lake bottom. It can be tied up right now by sediment, but when that sediment becomes anoxic or when oxygen levels are low, it will get released from the sediment. And so what the graphic is trying to show is that some phosphorus will come up from the bottom of the lake, especially in the summer period. And this is, we've got monitoring data that confirms that this has been a significant source of phosphorus in Keller Lake throughout the summer. Also, when we talk about these organic forms of phosphorus that come in, leaf litter, grass clippings, things like that, when they decay, they are also releasing phosphorus into shallow lakes like Keller Lake. So really what we're trying to do is manage both the internal and the external sources of phosphorus to improve and reduce the algal growth in Keller Lake. So if you go to the next plot, what we've got here is some actual data that correspond, and this is historical data, so each bar represents a summer average total phosphorus concentration. This is measured in parts per billion, or ppb in this example. So the y-axis on this graph is showing the, anywhere from 0 to about 140 parts per billion. The state standard is 60 for a shallow lake like Keller Lake, is 60 parts per billion. And so we want to get that lower level of phosphorus in the lake that we want to maintain. We want to stay at or below 60 as a summer average. And so these, you can see that the levels of phosphorus have fluctuated over the years. There have been some years in the mid-2000s, in the first decade of 2000, where concentrations for 3 separate summers were below 60, and then also in 1998. Those correspond with years where the iron dosing system was running and treating the flow that was coming in from Crystal Lake, that was being pumped in from Crystal Lake. For most of the other years, you can see that phosphorus was exceeding 60 parts per billion, and more recently, it's been more extensive in how far it's exceeded the standard until this past year in 2019, when an in-lake alum treatment was done for, first phase of an in-lake alum treatment was done for Keller Lake. So that reduced phosphorus that year, but several other attempts or other implementation projects have been done to reduce the phosphorus that's coming in from the watershed. And so the combination of those two activities has reduced phosphorus in the lake. How does this correspond then with the water clarity? If you would go to the next slide. I'm skipping over chlorophyll. There's a standard for that Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has for chlorophyll. And so by having phosphorus below 60, we hope to maintain chlorophyll, or the amount of algal growth below 20 parts per billion. And then that in turn should correspond to water clarities levels that exceed 1 meter, or like I said before, a little over 3 feet. And so that right now is the standard by MPCA. This graph that we're looking at now is showing the Secudus, and in this case, the y-axis is reversed. 0 is at the top, and the higher transparency, or how far you can see into the water, is better as you go farther down. And so here again, there were some years where the iron dosing system was running in the mid-2000s, 2007, 2008, 1998, where we had water clarity that was meeting the city of Burnsville goal. But then since that time, we've generally been below 1 meter, which is the state standard, and up until this last year in 2019, where, like I said, because of significant reductions that have been made in phosphorus that's getting into the lake, that in turn is supporting improved clarity. And but nonetheless, you can see it's in 2019, it's better than the state, but not quite as good as the city goal. Over the long term, you can see that it's very difficult without this iron dosing system that was running. In any other year, it's been very difficult just even to meet state standard, much less meet the city goal for water transparency. So if you go to the next slide, what ultimately I mentioned a little more than 5 years ago that the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency published a report about phosphorus levels in Keller Lake. Their main conclusions about that report and what needed to be done, primarily what they said about the main source of phosphorus, is that one of the main sources was internal load. So I talked about before, phosphorus getting released from the sediment, and this happens usually under low oxygen conditions in the middle of the summer, that alone was 40% of the average total phosphorus load to the lake. But we also needed to see at least a 50% reduction in the stormwater load that was coming in from the watershed, or as I referred to it earlier, external load. So it really required a combination of both phosphorus load reductions from the external sources and the internal sources. And ideally, we would reduce this internal source of phosphorus by at least 77% to meet the goals for the lake, and in turn see phosphorus levels that stay at or below 60 parts per billion. And so that's really what this report was published to prepare. And in a way, it kind of sets a phosphorus diet for the lake. And so since that time, if you'll go to the next slide, what has happened is you can see Keller Lake in the kind of the bottom left a third of the figure here. This is the watershed. Anything that is highlighted in the middle of this figure is any rainfall that falls on these areas and runs off will ultimately get to Keller Lake. And so about 2/3 of the watershed is actually in Apple Valley. So Keller Lake, the eastern border of Keller Lake is where the line is between Apple Valley and the city of Burnsville. And so what you can see here is we called out several places in the watershed where external load reductions have been made to get at that goal of getting at least a 50% reduction in the external load. And so the city of Apple Valley and the city of Burnsville have each implemented projects, and collectively they amount to a little more than 350 pounds of phosphorus that is reduced on an annual basis and on its way into Keller Lake, or as a part of the alum treatment, also reducing the internal sources to Keller Lake. So the expectation right now is with all these projects that have been completed, that our necessary phosphorus load reductions will be attained, and that we should be able to see ourselves meeting the water quality goals that this MPCA report had set for Keller Lake. And so this is where for phosphorus load reductions, that in turn, if you'll go to the next graph, shows how well phosphorus, when we look at this historical data that I've shown before. So we had those two bar charts before, one showing phosphorus, the other showing the Secchi disc that we have seen historically out there. We can create a XY graph here in this case, where phosphorus, the phosphorus that's been observed in each point on the graph here represents one of those years that we had monitoring data. And so there's an average phosphorus concentration from that year and an average water clarity or Secchi disc transparency that's been observed. And so each point here on the figure represents an average annual number from that historical data that I showed you before. And so what you can see is there's a strong relationship between phosphorus and Secchi disc transparency, or water clarity in this case. The more phosphorus we get, the lower the clarity in the water. And so the purple dash line is the best representation of how over the course of long-term monitoring, how well phosphorus is corresponding with Secchi disc transparency. But to be more conservative about how and where we should set goals for Keller Lake, what we did was we looked at the uncertainty around that, and you can see that right now the phosphorus all by itself is actually explaining more than half of the variability in the that we see with water clarity. But there is quite a bit of variation around that purple line. And so what we did was we created this lower confidence interval with the bottom red line there to show where we think that if we can, what it would take actually to meet the state standard, which is for water clarity, which is 1 meter. And so that corresponds actually very well with the state standard for total phosphorus, which is 60 parts per billion. And so it just so happens that based on the historical data from Keller Lake, you can see that by getting phosphorus at least down to 60, we will have a very good chance of meeting the state standard, because most of the points are higher or farther to the right of that, where that line crosses 60 parts per billion, and that we can get a water transparency that's going to be at least, like I said, 1 meter or a little over 3 feet. So this gives us more confidence that that goal can be met. But what you can see, if you look at this data a little more, is that the 1.8 meter city clarity goal that is currently in place is way up on the graph, and we would really need to have phosphorus levels down closer to 40 parts per billion, which is very hard to do. We'd be looking at making very significant reductions in phosphorus, and even then have a very difficult time of trying to to meet the current goal that the city has for water clarity. So if you'll go to the next slide, I can just try to summarize what we found then as a result of all of this data that we looked at. First conclusion is that, like I said, it's going to be very difficult to expect to meet that 1.8 meter or almost 6 foot goal for water transparency in Keller Lake. It's more realistic that the 1 meter goal, which also corresponds to the state standard for water transparency, can be met, especially at the phosphorus concentrations that we know we can maintain. So that here again, it comes back to what's attainable. And then we do think that 60 parts per billion standard is attainable. And then by doing that, we will still support the uses for Keller Lake that the state ideally wants us to support for shallow lakes. So the recommendation then is to adopt that same SECUDIS transparency goal as the state standard. And so like I said, this is all summarized in our report. And from that, then the requested action is what city staff would request is that the Parks and Natural Resources Commission recommend the city council approve our UAA report findings and the updated goal. So if you want to go to the last slide there, at this point, I'll take any questions.
And are there any questions for Greg tonight?
I have a few.
Okay.
Hello, thank you. It was a very thorough report. I'm just curious, when you had the meeting with the lake residents, what were they okay with the changing it from 1.8 to 1? What were some of their concerns?
Yes, I'll take a shot at that. I know Caleb was there too, and I'm sure he has more detailed notes than I do in front of me. But what I do recall is that, yeah, they did understand that. I think they were supportive of the recommendation. I think we had what we were getting were actually more questions about plant growth. And so you can imagine the other thing that comes with greater water transparency is there might be more of a tendency to have higher densities of plants and maybe plants at deeper depths in the lake. And so, if anything, I think they were more supportive of the 1 meter goal because that would keep some plant growth in check, at least to a degree. But that was the primary reaction I remember getting from the residents.
Okay, thank you. And then my second question, curious how this change, if any, will affect the water bodies down the watershed. I know Keller feeds right into Crystal Lake, which just got off the impaired list. In lowering that standard, will down the road with climate change and the way the weather, rain is supposed to happen, more and more runoff, how do you foresee that affecting down water bodies with that change?
Yes, so that's a great question. As it turns out, I talked about that Minnesota Pollution Control Agency report, and what it did was it actually included both Keller Lake and Crystal Lake and their watersheds in that same report. And so the diet, I talked about a phosphorus diet that came out of that report. The phosphorus diet for Keller Lake corresponds with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency standards in the same way that the standards in Crystal Lake were also applied in that same report. So as it turns out, when they went to set the levels of phosphorus that Crystal Lake could support, it was based on the assumption that we would meet those state standards in Keller Lake. And so, in other words, it's completely consistent with what we've just talked about with Keller Lake, is that the assumption that what would happen in Keller Lake and how that affects Crystal Lake is what we were talking about here is completely consistent with what the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency had assumed in their report for that what they refer to it as the total maximum daily load study.
Okay, thank you.
Any additional questions from commissioners?
Mark Cleveland here. Greg, I'm curious about what you thought about the efficacy of the treatments of the curly leaf pondweed, realizing that, if there's high levels of phosphorus, there's going to be something green, whether it's going to be vegetative, vascular plants like curly leaf, non-native or other natives, or filamentous algae or free-floating algae.
Good question. I do know that I think Caleb will be talking more about the plants in the lake here shortly. But I guess just from what we looked at, no, one of the things that is unique about curly leaf pondweed, you mentioned that, and what's distinguishes that from many of the other lake plants is that it does die off earlier in the summer. So when it dies off and it decays, you can get some phosphorus release from that. And so, yeah, I know that the city staff, in fact, has made significant efforts over the years. In fact, we've got a table in our report that summarizes the phosphorus load reduction that we think comes with patrolling curly leaf pondweed. And so that has been discussed in the report. But that is a internal source of phosphorus. And so, yeah, we do recognize that in the report, and then we do even try to quantify that. But I think any efforts to control that are definitely beneficial for a couple of reasons. One, reduces phosphorus. Two, it improves the lake ecology for Keller Lake. So I hope I answered your question, but if I didn't, I know, like I said, that Caleb will be talking more about curly leaf.
No, thank you, Greg.
Any additional questions from commissioners? All right, so I think staff is seeking a motion that this commission recommends the city council approval of the findings and updates the clarity goals. Do we have anybody that would like to motion?
So moved.
All right, thank you. And a second?
I'll second.
All right, so staff, can we do a roll call vote?
You bet. Commissioner Angara,
Aye.
Commissioner Arnold,
Aye.
Commissioner Cleveland,
Aye.
Commissioner Donaldson. Still with us? Commissioner Fitchett,
Aye.
Chair Newman,
Aye.
Vice Chair Woolman.
All right, and it passes. Thank you very much, Greg, for your presentation tonight.
Thank you.
All right, and now we're going to move on to our next agenda item, which is with Caleb Ashling. And it's the report on invasive species in parks and an update on the Buckthorn control program.
All right. Good evening, commissioners. Thank you for having me tonight. As I mentioned, my name is Caleb Ashling, and my role with the city is I'm a natural resources specialist with the Natural Resources Department. And I'm here just to give kind of a quick update on what we've got going on related to invasive species in the parks. And my understanding was this was a presentation or information requested by the commissioners earlier in the year, so hopefully I'm covering what you're interested in. Next slide, please. I'll just start with a basic definition. So invasive species are plants, animals, or pathogens that are non-native to the ecosystem and whose introduction causes or is likely to cause harm. So there are a lot of non-native species around, and I'm going to be talking mostly about plants today, but there's a lot of non-native plants around, like dandelions, but they're not all causing ecological harm. They may be causing harm to your lawns if you don't like dandelions, but they're not all causing harm in our natural areas. So the ones that we're really focusing on are those non-native invasive plant species that are causing ecological harm. And there's a lot of good reasons to control invasive species. I think you could go back for 1 second. Part of it is that our invasive species outcompete a lot of our native plants. And the native plants are kind of the basis for, or the basic feeding block for a lot of our wildlife species. So if you take monarch butterflies, for example, they rely on the native plant species milkweed. And if we don't have milkweeds around, because they've been outcompeted by invasive species, then monarch butterfly caterpillars don't have anything to eat, and we don't have monarchs. But monarchs are just one example. There's many butterflies, bees, moths that feed on specific native plants. And without those native plants, we lose a lot of our insects in particular, and then we don't have food for birds and other animals all up the food chain. So invasive species can really disrupt our ecosystems. And then invasive species can also cause other issues like soil erosion, when you get bare soils underneath buckthorn, for example. And also in this photo below, I have a kind of before and after from one of our oak savanna restoration projects out at Terrace Oaks. Invasive species can impact our people's use of parks as well. So it's not all just about other plants and wildlife. Removing buckthorn in particular, we've heard from residents, can help improve their park experience because they can see through the natural area. They see more wildlife because it's not like walking through a dark green tunnel. And they get a little bit of breeze to keep the mosquitoes away. So by doing invasive species work, we can also improve the park experience for park users. Next slide, please. So I'm going to be talking not just about some specific species, but also talking a little bit about the strategy that we use for invasive species control. And one of the first steps in our program is to really have realistic goals about what we're trying to accomplish. And with invasive species, we're really not trying to eradicate them. We're trying to control them in certain areas. But for the majority of them, we're not going to completely eradicate them from the city. So buckthorn, for example, which is an invasive shrub that many of you are probably familiar with, it's going to always be in Burnsville, but we can control it in select areas and have all those environmental benefits that I mentioned. But we know that we're not going to get rid of it everywhere. And due to that, and also due to limited resources, we also want to make sure we have a prioritized approach. So we're not going to be able to control invasive species everywhere in every single park throughout the city. We have to look at where we have some of our highest quality natural areas, or maybe where there's high use of the park, so we are going to have a lot of benefit to park users as well, and prioritize our approach that way, which we have laid out in our Natural Resources Master Plan. And then we also have to factor in that invasive species, in particular buckthorn removal, isn't a once and done thing. It's something that you have to do an initial control, but then you also have to do follow-up maintenance in the years to come. So we have to build our invasive species and habitat management program with that long-term maintenance in mind, and make sure that as we add new areas and new invasive species control areas, we're also still setting aside enough time and resources to maintain the ones that we've already worked on. Then another part of our control strategy is just being selective and careful with our methods. So when possible, try to time our methods to reduce the impact on wildlife or desirable native species. And when using herbicide, to try to use as little herbicide as necessary to get the job done. Next slide, please. Then another important part of our program is to not just focus on invasive species, but to also consider how to promote conditions that will support our native plant communities. So basically, we don't just want to try to kill the bad stuff. We want to think about why was it there to begin with, and how can we make our native plants more competitive in those areas, so we can have a more sustainable management program long term. And so some of the ways we do that is just by trying to recreate some of the more historical conditions. For example, if we're trying to manage savanna, we also may remove weedy trees in those areas in addition to invasive species. We may do controlled burns to try to recreate some of the historic or human created fires that managed the land in the past. And we're exploring prescribed grazing with goats right now, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And then also to think about how high nutrient levels in our waters or in our land can impact invasive species as well. And then when we don't have enough native plants out on the landscape, we also want to make sure to plant native plants into our invasive species control areas at the appropriate time to make sure we have competition. Because if there's no competition, it's hard to get rid of the invasives. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to be talking kind of generally about our aquatic areas, our open space or prairie management, and then onto our woodland management. And then just talking about our invasive species management in aquatic areas. One of our prime control targets is curly pondweed, as Greg mentioned. And we're managing that at Crystal Lake, Keller Lake, and Alamagnet Lake. And we also do some plant surveys in some of our other lakes to monitor whether it's becoming a problem. We do track Eurasian water milfoil, which is another problematic invasive, but so far we haven't done a lot of control on that in our lakes. Next slide, please. Then Crystal Lake in particular, because that is one of our busiest or the busiest recreational water body in Burnsville with boats coming in and out. We also do some additional monitoring for invasive species to try to prevent new infestations, especially for zebra mussels in particular. So we've obtained a grant from Dakota County for the past several years to do increased boat inspections. So we have boat inspectors at the launch Memorial Day through Labor Day, Friday through Sunday, who are inspecting boats coming in and out and looking for invasive species and trying to remove any potential invasive species before they get in, and also just educating lake users on invasive species risk. And then we've also obtained a grant the last 2 years to hire a consultant to do some early detection surveys in Crystal Lake, where they do some underwater searches around the boat launch area to see if they can detect zebra mussels. And in that boat launch area is probably the most likely place where we'd catch an early infestation. And luckily, we have not found them in Crystal Lake, so that's great news. But we are trying to be proactive about prevention and early detection. Next slide, please. Then on to our invasive species management in prairie and open space. So we have numerous areas throughout Burnsville that we manage as kind of prairie or open space habitat. The total is around 95 acres that kind of fall in that category. Some of the biggest examples of it are at Kramer Preserve, Sunset Pond, Alamagnet Prairie, or the prairie near City Hall, the Civic Center Prairie. But we have other sites as well. And then on the right hand side here, I've just got a list of some of the priority species that we manage. And those include Canada thistle, birdsfoot trefoil, spotted knapweed, crown vetch, leafy spurge, wild parsnip, purple loosestrife, and reed canary grass. Next slide, please. I wanted to highlight two of those. The first is wild parsnip. If you're not familiar with it, it is not a nice invasive plant. It has sap that if you get it on your skin and it's exposed to sunlight, it will cause severe blistering. So kind of similar to somewhat similar to poison ivy, though a little different as well, but generally very unpleasant. And it is an invasive species that is spreading. It is in Burnsville. It's been here for a little while, but we are seeing it pop up more and more. So So it's one that we want to keep an eye out for and get more education out to the public, and also just try to do our best to control it. It's a biennial species, so the picture on the top is the first year, what the first year plant looks like. So it's a basal or rosette of leaves that just kind of hang out at the ground layer. And then in the second year, it sends up a flowering stalk with these yellow flowers and an umbel, kind of upside down umbrella-like appearance. And we're working, it's not widespread yet, so I don't want to make anyone think that it's going to be all over the place, but we are working on trying to keep it from becoming widespread. We just entered into a cooperative weed management area that was organized by Dakota County Soil and Water. And that wild parsnip is one of the species that will be a focus for control for that group across, for the partners that joined at least across the Dakota County. And that cooperative weed management area will just be a resource for agencies to work together to try to manage invasive species, especially as they're spreading along park borders, or this one in particular spreads a lot along highway corridors by mowing equipment. So we can work with different agencies that may be in Burnsville and around Burnsville to work together on control. The next slide, please. Then I did also want to highlight one example of some biocontrol that we're doing for invasive species. And this is with the invasive species purple loosestrife. But there's so biocontrol is the use of insects in this example that are native to the host country where purple loosestrife came from. But they weren't brought over originally with purple loosestrife. So purple loosestrife normally doesn't have many or any natural predators. So people have done a lot of research to determine whether there's any kind of pests that feed on purple loosestrife that are from the host country, but that won't feed on any other plants. And they've identified several beetles for purple loosestrife that were good candidates. These were brought over and released in different areas around the country and in Minnesota. And we've done several releases through the years at Sunset Pond, Crystal Lake, Magnet Park, and others. And this beetle just helps provide a bit of a check and balance for purple loosestrife. It doesn't outright eradicate it, so it's not going to be gone because of these beetles, but it will at least weaken it a little bit to hopefully make it a little less competitive than it otherwise would be. So that's one example of a biocontrol insect. We've also used biocontrol insects for leafy spurge and spotted knapweed. Next slide, please. Then on to our invasive species management in woodland areas. And that focuses on a few different species, but especially on control of common buckthorn. But other species we manage are invasive honeysuckles, garlic mustard, oriental bittersweet, and Japanese hedge parsley. And right now we're managing around 160 acres of different invasive species removal and restoration areas in our park system. Some of the bigger examples are at Terrace Oaks Park, Keller Park, Magnet Park, and Kramer Nature Preserve, but we have many other sites. Next slide, please. So for some of these bigger woodland or buckthorn removal projects, we focus on trying to obtain some large grants that help us tackle a big project at once. For example, we recently, in the last 2 years, did a 26-acre removal at Terrace Oaks Park. So those are really expensive projects, so we look for grant opportunities to help fund some of the upfront costs with those removals. So we periodically try to get those grants to help take on big chunks all at once. But we've also been utilizing an institutional work group program for the past 4 or 5 years that helps us do some annual removal and expansion of some of our removal areas on some of our smaller priority sites, like around Crystal Lake and Early Lake and Alamagnet Lake. So we've been especially using that crew to help remove buckthorn along some of our buffer areas to strengthen buffers around some of our priority water bodies. And through that removal program, we've removed we removed 700 cubic yards in 2019, and that's been a pretty typical amount for the past few years. And then along with those different hired crew efforts, we also have a volunteer program that we promote. So residents can sign up to remove buckthorn in the areas where we have kind of active control going on. Or residents can also sign up to work on an area that may not be on our priority list. It may be a small park that is in their neighborhood that they'd like to work on. And if they're able to put in the labor, which is the primary cost, we can work with them to help remove buckthorn on some of those lower priority sites as well. The next slide, please. Then just in general, with common buckthorn, just a few things that we're finding success with in our control program. We're finding that when we can open areas up and create some less shade in the environment, we're finding that we can get better native plant establishment underneath in areas where buckthorn has previously been removed. And when we're getting that competition going in the understory, we have better long-term success with keeping the buckthorn out. And then we're also finding that where we can feasibly implement controlled burns, that is a big aid in also keeping the buckthorn out long-term. Next slide, please. And then I've just got a couple examples. This might be a little hard to see, I'm sorry for that, but I've just got a couple examples of kind of where we're at in a few of our parks. This map is from Alamagnet Park, and the area kind of circled overall in light green is the city park boundary. The areas in red are our woodland restoration or buckthorn removal area. So you can see we have two kind of large areas where we've removed buckthorn, and one area over on the left side there as well. And then on the lower left side of the picture here, or the map, we have an area in yellow, and that's one of our prairie restoration units at Alamagnet Park, where we are also managing invasive species. So we've got around, I think this is around 40 acres of restored habitat that we're working on, and we probably have a similar amount of unrestored habitat at the park that's natural area. There's also ball fields and stuff there. But that's kind of where we're at Alamagnet Park. Next slide, please. And this slide or map shows Terrace Oaks Park. Again, that kind of light green shows the overall park boundary. And we've been focusing a lot of our efforts on the northern third of the park. That's kind of the most accessible portion of the park. So that's been where we've started. The area in red, that's existing restored areas that we've already taken out buckthorn and other invasive species. There's a small yellow prairie unit on the left side there as well. And then on the right side there's an area in orange that is a proposed project that we currently have a grant application in for, and if we're funded, that would be done in the next 2 years or so. So at Terrace Oaks, the red areas are around 50 acres. That orange area would be 22 acres. So we're hoping that if we're able to proceed with that project in orange there, that we'd have around about the northern third of the park in active restoration, and we'd still have the other 2/3 to work on down the road as well. Next slide, please. Then I also wanted to just highlight that we do have Buckthorn programs for private property as well. So we offer our yearly Take Back Your Woods workshop every September, and that's been well attended. Most years we get between 30 and 50 people to attend that. And then we have a Buckthorn pickup program where the city will come to private property where groups or people who own a large lot have submitted an application and the application has been approved. So we do have that pickup program. We have usually between 7 to 13 groups or projects per year. We've been ranging from around 300 to 600 cubic yards of material removed. And for example, in 2019, we had one of our higher years in that range. So we had 13 groups and about 577 cubic yards of material removed between all those groups. And that's primarily or almost all Buckthorn. Then we also have our compost site drop-offs. So for folks who can't or don't need to do the pickup program, we do open up our city compost site 8 to 9 weekends per year for Buckthorn disposal. And we've done that for around 8 or 9 years, and we've been ranging about 300 to 500 cubic yards per year. So between the Buckthorn removal on our private property programs and also the city programs, we're removing quite a bit of material per year. Next slide, please.
0.
All right, does anybody have any questions?
Any questions for Caleb?
Yeah, Caleb, Mark Cleveland here. So when you're doing the cooperation with the local landowners, I'm assuming, homeowners and so forth, is the city providing method recommendations such as stump treatments, basal bark treatments, so they don't end up with a new hedge of buckthorn?
Yes, absolutely. So we really strongly encourage our participants to attend our workshop, which they can kind of get all that information directly at the workshop. And for those who aren't able to attend that, we do site visits with them prior to the project so we can explain all those methods and make sure they're doing it correctly and hopefully reduce their long-term maintenance issues.
Thank you.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, Dana.
Yeah, I noticed when I was reading the report on Keller Lake that you were trying a herbicide instead of the harvesting there for the curly leaf. Did I read that right? I'm wondering what the results of that are.
Yeah, so we've been doing herbicide on Keller Lake for 4 years now, and so far it's been very effective at controlling curly leaf. And we're starting to see some native plants reestablish, and we're also doing a plant reintroduction project to try to diversify the native plants that are present. But the herbicide has been pretty effective at controlling the curly leaf. And Keller Lake is a little different than some of our other water bodies, like Crystal Lake, for example, because it had very, very low diversity of other types of native plants to begin with. Some of our other water bodies, like Crystal Lake, have a really high diversity of native plants, and so we be very hesitant about using more aggressive methods like herbicide. But because Keller Lake had a lower diversity to begin with, it was a more reasonable approach there. And then we also, because we were also doing some more intensive nutrient reduction, like an alum treatment, we also felt like it was a good time to try to knock the curly leaf out and to get some other types of native plants establishing.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, this is Shannon. I'm wondering, has there been any consequences for bringing in like outside beetles for biocontrol or anything like that?
Yeah, good question. The species that we've been using, I'm not aware of any negative side effects of those. I know that there have been examples kind of in the earlier stages of biocontrols where there were species brought over that caused unintended effects. Not necessarily, or not in Burnsville, but just talking more broadly, across the country as people started trying that method. But they've gotten a lot more intensive about the research process and making sure that they're really studying all the different things that all those unintended impacts to try to reduce the risk of that.
Thank you.
So Caleb, I guess one of my questions are, with the boat monitoring and even the Buckthorn control program, those seem to happen mostly during the summer or in the early part of the fall. With some more of our erratic weather patterns that we seem to be having more and more, have we considered expanding those to more opportune times of the year? Like Labor Day, people were boating into October this year. And the same thing even for buckthorn removal, when we have that through October only and it snows a week into October, it's tough for residents likely to get that done. Have we considered expanding those two particular programs?
Yeah, we have not considered expanding the boat launch program, so that's definitely something that we could look at. So yeah, that's definitely something that we could consider that we just haven't in the past. I think in the past we had picked Labor Day because schools are starting around then and boat traffic just was reducing. But you're right, conditions are changing, so that's something that we could consider for the future. And then with the Buckthorn program, we have considered doing the drop-offs or the pickup program into November. But just the conditions get so much more erratic where you might, if we're working with the resident on a pickup program, it may snow like it did this year, 4 inches, and just it has made scheduling more difficult when we've looked at extending those out. So I think it's something that we could consider. We've just run into more issues as we get into November with the erratic weather, which can cause some problems.
Sure. It just seems to be more prolific than it has been in past years. My other question, so you mentioned some of the invasive species that are spread by the mowing equipment. I know last year we had a presentation about reducing some of the mowing in our parks and restoring some of those natural areas. Is that part of this invasive species management program, is to reduce that mowing and potential spreading of those particular seeds through that mechanism? And is there an update maybe at some point, JJ, that we could get on that particular program? Sorry, JJ, I made you sit back down.
No, that's okay, Chair Newman. This summer, there were a number of areas where we had the reduced mowing, and that was more of a staff and time related issue. I don't know, Caleb, if anything was tracked as far as the spread of any species this summer. I think it was just a matter of time savings.
It'd be one of those things where the city's saving money, but we're also potentially adding some benefit to the environment too. So it might be a nice way of tracking some of that for some of the residents to see, hey, it doesn't only have this benefit of saving the city program money, but it also has the ability to spread, curtail some of the spread of some of these invasive species.
Sure.
Nobody wants wild parsnip in their backyard, right? So if you can reduce that by having taller grasses, right, in a part of the park, that might be a benefit to not, sometimes I think we get negative feedback associated with not mowing particular areas of the park. But if people understand the trade-offs associated with it, does that help?
Sure. Again, Chair Newman, I think, as we move forward and get into December, we'll be planning our 2021 year, and one of the things I think we could probably put on that list is an update on the changes to our parks and how we've adjusted some of those things in our frameworks plan.
Yeah.
And I think we could probably touch on that. We'll work with Caleb and put some information in there that relates to that, not just so that it's not just identified as a time-saving or a money-saving thing. It's a benefit also to the environment.
Yeah, great. So maybe less of a question, Caleb, and more of a comment. Any other questions for, yeah, Mark?
Yeah, tied to the mowing and timing, I think Caleb alluded to that, that some of our practices move things around. That's how wild parsnip moves up and down county highways and state highways and so forth. And I'm assuming that the plan will incorporate blooming times, seed set, and those kinds of issues. So we're targeting the right times to be doing things and making hopefully less work for ourselves long term as well. Birchwood trefoil, crown vetch, all of those are, one seed set, we move stuff around. And certainly wild parsnip is one we want to keep out of the city as much as we can, or at least keep it localized. So I'm assuming that's something that's in the plan.
Yes, yeah, that's something that we work on. Partly those timings, and sometimes there is mowing that's done for right-of-way purposes where there may not always be as much flexibility on the timing. So we're also working with our mowing operators to educate them on, especially things like parsnip, which can be mowed around if you happen to find it before. If you happen to find a new patch, you can mow around it, which is better than mowing through it and spreading it somewhere else. So yeah, we're working on timing and education with our mowing staff to help reduce those issues.
Is there a training program are there training materials that you share with them to get them up to speed?
There's some good handouts from the Department of Agriculture, and also just photos and site visits as well.
Sounds like being part of that cooperative weed management area is going to be a good source of additional opportunities to spread information, not invasive species.
Yes, yeah, we hope so. We just joined that just a week or two ago, formally through City Council. So that's just kind of getting up and going, but we're hoping that it will be a nice partnership between different agencies.
All right, any final questions for Caleb on this topic? Otherwise, I don't think we need any formal motions on this one. And pause for a second. Otherwise, we'll move on to your next presentation, Caleb, which is an update on the Civic Center prescribed grazing project. In other words, the goats.
Yes, all right, thank you. So yeah, my next presentation is just a bit of a recap on what we've learned from our 3 years of our prescribed grazing pilot project out at Civic Center Park. Next slide, please. And just a bit of a background, prescribed grazing is using livestock animals, in this case goats, for a designated amount of time to come out and control vegetation. And after that, they're removed from the site. So we're not talking about goats as pets. We're talking about animals that are out to do a job to help us control vegetation. And we started this 3-year pilot project using goats to control buckthorn back in 2018. And we identified a 2.2 acre area at the park there for the project. It was initially allowed by special city council approval, but in 2019, the ordinances were actually amended to allow prescribed grazing on park property and also on private property more broadly, but there are restrictions on how it can be used. Next slide, please. And the goals of our pilot project with goats was to try to control buckthorn, restore native grasses and wildflowers, restore oak savanna habitat. So kind of similar to a lot of our restoration project goals. But then along with that, we wanted to evaluate goats as a control method. So what can we learn about how they work, and is it something that we want to have kind of in our management toolbox? We've got a lot of other tools in that toolbox, like herbicide spraying, brush cutting, mowing, or the use of controlled burns. But we wanted to learn a little bit more about prescribed grazing to see if it's something that would be useful in our projects. Next slide. So with this pilot project, we had a few kind of basic steps. The first step back in 2018 was to remove the mature buckthorn and some of the weedier tree species to really try to open that area up. That was done in the winter, and you can see the slides at the bottom of the page here that shows kind of before that removal and then after when it's much more opened up. So that was kind of the first basic step because the goats aren't going to control the big buckthorn, so we had to get rid of that first. They're more for controlling the smaller stuff. Then we immediately followed that with seeding of native grasses. There was some existing native wildflowers on site as well. And then from 2018 through 2020, we had a contractor come in with goats once a year and conduct the prescribed grazing. And then in 2020, we also had built up enough vegetation fuel that we conducted a controlled burn out there as well. Next slide. All right, so as I mentioned, the goats don't target the big buckthorn. So what we were hoping they would do, or kind of the goal, was for the goats to come in and target the sapling-sized buckthorn. So whenever you take out mature buckthorn, you're always going to have seedlings and sapling buckthorn that immediately try to take back over. So we brought in the goats to feed on that sapling buckthorn. So basically strip the leaves, they kind of chew on the end of the branches as well. Next slide, please. And so they can strip off the vegetation, and it doesn't outright kill the buckthorn, but hopefully it weakens it, while also allowing some of the plants growing underneath the buckthorn to get larger and provide more competition for it. So kind of over time to try to use the goats. And for other types of projects, instead of goats, we might use herbicide to spray that sapling buckthorn. So this was just an alternative method to use a different control method to deal with that follow-up small size buckthorn. Next slide, please. So what did they do out there when they got there? And this is a photo of the goats arriving at the site for the first time back in 2018. Next slide, please. So this is kind of a typical picture of the project area. The goats like to hang out all together in a group most of the time. They are kind of lounging around in this particular picture, but the majority of the time they're actually eating, and they eat a lot, so they work pretty amazingly fast, and it's kind of fun to watch. Next slide, please. But this is a pre-grazing photo on one of the years that they were out there, so you can see a lot of green leaf vegetation, and this is primarily buckthorn. Then if you look at an after photo, which if you could go to the next slide, please, you'll see that they really strip off all that green vegetation. They don't just eat buckthorn. If you leave them in there long enough, they eat just about everything down to an inch or so off the ground. So they're really good at eating, which is good. That's why we brought them there. And then they also will girdle some smaller size buckthorn and some other thinner bark trees. We didn't have a lot of this size buckthorn in the project area. We just kind of fenced in a little bit of it just to see what they do. But they will girdle some of this size stuff, and there are other people who are experimenting with having them girdle bigger buckthorn in the winter, which is when they're more likely to chew on it. And when they girdle trees like that, it doesn't kill them, but it forces them to resprout from the ground. Next slide, please. So did it work from kind of a longer term perspective and relative to some of the goals that we set out that I mentioned earlier in my presentation? Next slide. So from our goal of controlling buckthorn, what we have found through the 3 years of the project that it suppressed the buckthorn, but it didn't kill the buckthorn, which we weren't necessarily thinking that it would all be outright killed. But for the most part, it seems like it has mostly been suppressed, so weakened, but not enough to the point where it's actually dying yet, or at least a large amount of it isn't dying. And just in general, I should state that a lot of the summaries that I'm coming up with are based on our photos and just our personal staff knowledge of the site through the years of the project. We don't have any survey data from it, so it's more generalized summaries that we have. We found that it seemed like there was less buckthorn in the sunnier areas, and in some of those areas where we had better pockets of native plants to begin with, it seemed like the buckthorn was further stressed in those areas. But although it didn't kill the buckthorn, what we found was that it suppressed it enough that it's still only several feet tall in most areas or shorter. And you can see in this photo here on the left, that's what the project area looks like now. Just 30 feet to the right of the project area, which you can see in the adjacent photo, is what it looks like outside the project area. And without the goats to help do the control, it would have been pretty quickly getting back to that really encroached, filled-in woodland area. So it has helped keep the area open, but it hasn't outright killed the buckthorn yet. Next slide, please. And then as far as our goal of restoring native grasses and wildflowers, we did see a good establishment of the native grasses coming in that we seeded, and that you can see some of those species in the photo on the left here. So with the goats to help strip the buckthorn and keep the shade, reduce some of the shading each year, I think that helped the natives get established. Then we also did see some spread of wildflowers that were already on the site throughout the project area. So those have been slow to spread, but we are seeing them move around and expand, like the sweet-scented Joe Pyeweed here and goldenrod. And next slide, please. And then one kind of neat aspect of the project was that we did find a rusty patched bumblebee out there this past fall. So that's a federally endangered bumblebee species that was using a native thistle that was on the project site. So by removing the buckthorn and kind of opening the area up, we were getting more wildflowers established, and some of those wildflowers were supporting this federally endangered bee, which is nice to see the wildlife utilizing the site. Next slide, please. And then to the goal of restoring oak savanna habitat, as you can kind of see in the photo here, we have created an area where we've opened the area up a lot. We have more scattered tree growth, and we have that kind of diverse understory layer of grasses, wildflowers, and buckthorn. So we've made good progress in getting some of the oak savanna habitat set up, where we've got sunny areas for some oak regeneration. We are building a really nice burnable fuel layer where we can utilize controlled burns periodically in the future years to help with our woody management. So it takes a while to fully restore habitat, but we're setting some of the pieces in place in the first couple of years there. Next slide, please. And then just kind of digging into a little more about evaluating goats as a control method, just from what we've seen from the past few years. And from what I've seen, I believe that using goats for prescribed grazing works. But that if we wanted to see more buckthorn dying off or getting stressed out faster, we'd likely want to do a twice a year grazing instead of once a year. We were able to kind of suppress it and sort of hold our own and get some native plants established with the once a year. But I think the twice a year grazing would probably put us in a better position for getting closer to killing it or killing more of it than the once a year. But because there are alternative methods to goats out there, and some of them are cheaper than using goats in some situations, it comes down to kind of a cost-benefit analysis between those other methods. And so I think that goats are going to be especially useful in areas that may be very steep, where other methods are more difficult or expensive, sites that are rocky, where some mechanical equipment may not be very feasible, or sites with potentially sensitive plant species where we're really trying to reduce herbicide use. I think those are some areas where that cost-benefit analysis may tip the scales more in favor of using goats. And then I also think that as the cost for using goats comes down, I think there will probably be more and more opportunities to use them in our sites. We have seen over the 3-year period that the costs have started to come down already, and we are seeing more companies pop up that are catering to this field, so it does seem to be growing. And as I think we get more competition in there, hopefully those costs will come down and make it more cost effective in more situations. And then also through this project discovered just in general that goats, as I mentioned, are really great at stripping green vegetation, but not only just the buckthorn, they also can remove a lot of other green vegetation, and sometimes they're even eating leaves off the ground. And what we found is that really can encourage more, by exposing more soil, it really encourages a lot of new germination of other types of plants, and that can help provide more competition in that understory layer, and build more fuel for controlled burns. And then we also, because some of what they do has sort of a similar end product to a burn in that vegetation removal, there may be situations where we could use goats instead of burning to have some of the same effect in sites that may be a little bit damp to burn, or maybe there's not good areas to put the smoke due to homes or roads nearby. So there could be other situations that we could use goats for kind of a burn-like method when that's what we're looking for. And then they do, there is more research out there, especially in aquatic environments, but becoming more in terrestrial environments, that high nutrients in the soil or in the water lead to invasive species. So when goats are feeding on the land, eating green material and utilizing that for muscle mass and fat, for removing some nutrients from the system, and that likely has some benefit, though. I think there's a lot more research that it needs to be done, and some groups are looking at in that area. Next slide, please. Right, I think that was one of my last slides here, and just continuing on that, evaluating the goats as a control method. One thing that we really found successful was that goats were a really amazing public engagement tool. That's not why we got into it. We got into it because we thought that I think they can really be a benefit to our land management practices. But they really are great for getting people excited about land management. If you have someone with a tractor versus goats, the goats are going to be a lot more exciting for people. And this site in particular, we found that we were nearby to several adjacent schools. So we were able to get school groups out there to do some meet and greets with the goats while they were out there. And that gave us a chance to teach the kids about buckthorn and land management. So that was a great thing. And then we also found that there were just a lot of people that stopped by to see them pretty regularly. It wasn't a huge crowd, but there was often somebody there visiting the goats just to learn more about it and see them in action. And then we got good engagement from some local press media, social media, and our website as well. And that just in general helps us educate the public and get the word out about buckthorn and other land management activities. So there was a lot of great benefit to having the goats on site just from getting people some education on the work we're doing. Next slide, please. All right, and so just our future plans with this project. We plan on continuing to use the goats in this Civic Center project area. I think we're still debating whether we'll continue with the once a year, just to see if we continue that a little bit longer where we end up, or whether we'll switch to the twice a year. But we would like to continue with this project just to see kind of how it pans out at this site. And then we'll look to utilize goats in other locations where it makes sense. We've already started using them at Kramer Nature Preserve at a site where we have some rocks, lots of rocks, I should say. It tends to be damp, so controlled burning is challenging. So on sites where we have some of those other factors, we'll look to use them where feasible. And with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you.
Nice job, Caleb.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, I have
Any
a question.
questions?
Okay, I have a question. This is Nelson. If I understood correctly, I think you mentioned there were restrictions on prescribed grazing. And if so, what are some of those restrictions?
And the biggest restriction for private property is that you have to have at least a half an acre of parcel size. So that's the primary restriction on whether you can have goats or not. So if you have a parcel that's at least a half acre, then you're good to go. If you have a parcel that's smaller, the only other option would be to combine a grazing area that's at least a half acre. So if you and several neighbors have a shared wooded lot that's at least a half acre, you can use goats. But it's mostly that half acre overall parcel size. And then that's the main restriction, I would say. And then the rest of it is just rules on how long you can keep the goats. You know, there's a certain amount of time they can stay there. There's certain rules on the fencing, things like that. But that's more, once they're out there, what they can do. But it's not restriction per se.
Okay, thank you.
Any additional questions for Caleb? Thank you for that update, Caleb. Definitely have some nice mascots there. And with that, we're going to move on to our next presentation, which is an update on the scheduled or program uses of city parks. And that is by Scott Heitkamp and David Erdel, sorry.
All right, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Well, first off, I wanted to thank the commission and commissioners for allowing us this opportunity to share all that's gone on in the recreation department over the past. I think it was a year ago that we got to provide an update to the group last time. So it's definitely been an interesting and challenging year, to say the least. So just to give you a little background of who I am, and then I'll let David provide an update once he starts speaking as well. But Scott Heitkamp, I'm a recreation programmer too. So basically what I do for the department, I supervise all of our adult athletic leagues, all of our field scheduling, both youth and adults, which encompasses tournaments as well. Work with food vendors in our parks, various special events that we have done, and then some miscellaneous park projects and such. And And I also am the city liaison to our youth associations. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. So wanted to provide just a little bit of a review to how our department has been affected by the pandemic and by COVID-19. We generally put together our recreation times, which is our brochure and synopsis of everything that we got coming up in the next few months. So we started that planning for the spring and summer offerings that we were going to have that for the spring and summer, and in about January and February is when we finalized that. And I believe March 10th, if that sounds right, is when the rec times actually hit homes and was delivered to homes. And I think the pandemic started less than a week after that. So we basically had to wipe our hands clean and stop all of that planning that we were doing and turn on a 180-degree dial and really rethink what it is that we were going to be doing into the future, if whatever that was and whatever resources we had. So when I say that we had nearly about 50 recreational programs that we had planned into that Rec Times brochure, some of the bigger ones there are laid out with Kids of Summer and Party on the Plaza and such. Those are individual programs, so to speak. So when we start to get into, so Flicks on the Bricks, for example, we had about seven dates planned for just Flicks on the Bricks. So if you get into how many actual sessions or how many actual dates that we had planned, you get up into around the 200, between 200 and 300 range. So there was a ton of planning that went on with the recreation department that really had to be thrown away and scrapped and redone. So that was challenge number one, which was a big one. But also a big challenge was the staffing limitations that we had. First with full-time staff and the reallocation to other departments. David, for example, who's going to be speaking here, he was on a mower all summer and didn't get to do any of those programs that he had planned. Also, some other staff was sent to communications and natural resources. So we really just had two main programming staff that were left to kind of carry forward whatever it is that we were going to come up with for the spring and summer and how we were going to continue to stay relevant. And also another challenge was the fact that we did not hire any seasonal staff, not only for programming and to staff the Kids of Summer that we normally have on a given year, but also the parks maintenance staff, which obviously had a trickle-down effect with us, in which we had to then be moved over to fill those voids and to help keep up with all of the daily maintenance that goes on in our city, which we found out is more than we knew. So that is it for this slide. Why don't you head to the next one, please? So just to give you, sorry, I gotta swipe here. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of how we went about programming during COVID-19, and I think the first question we asked was where do we start and how do we start? But I kind of broke it down here into three different categories, so to speak, and the adult sports leagues are one of those programs or offerings that we have that we normally have on a normal year. So we did have some of those that we continued to offer, and we obviously had to modify these very greatly and to make sure that everybody was participating in a safe manner. So it was great that we were able to still offer these leagues, even though they looked quite different than what they would on a normal year. And then we had the virtual programming that really was the forefront to our focus once the pandemic started, being that we were in lockdown and we didn't have any way to program in person, for example. And the rec vacation, that was one of our biggest initiatives that we had from the start, and ways that we got creative of how are we gonna connect and engage the community to continue to see the recreation department's relevance and the fact that we are still here and we're still trying to offer as much as we can in a variety of programs, diversity of programs that we can reach everybody no matter where you are, who you are, or where you live, whatever it is. So that after we kind of got into our virtual programming and then things started to loosen up a little bit, which opened up our opportunities and offerings more than we could, which we could start going into in-person programming a little bit. Now this required a ton of communication and a ton of safety measures, which we'll get into here in a little bit, but there was a lot of behind the scenes work that went into how can we safely put on these programs while the community and participants know that they're being safe and feel that they are in a safe environment. And as we move on to the next slide here, I'll let you fast forward. Here are some of the events that we had completed during these difficult and challenging times. We had a drive-through for a difference event in which we had we had firefighters and fire trucks, we had police officers, and we had some public works machines out there. This was our first attempt at in-person programming in which folks could get out of the house. They would stay inside their car and just drive through this reverse style parade, get to interact with those in the community and the heroes of our community, which we call them. So that was a fun way to finally get to see the community out in public and be able to finally see them back in a recreation program, which we were so used to seeing. Another good event that we had, or virtual program that we had, was this Anyway 5K, in which you had a certain amount of time to go through and complete a 5K and submit your proof or tracking that you had completed the 5K and completed your mileage, and we encouraged you to send in photos of you and your family completing this. And then as soon as you did, you got a free t-shirt, or not a free t-shirt, but a t-shirt for completing the program. So that was fun again to see the interaction and social media posting of folks that completed that. A big one for us was our drive-in movies. We ended up pulling off 3 different drive-in movies this year, one in June, July, and August. That was crazy. It was a ton of fun. We found ways to adapt to how many vehicles we could have on site and how are we gonna safely have this many people in somewhat of a smaller area, in which we found ways to safely offer that. And it was, as you saw on the last slide, there was some great photo opportunities, and it was kind of those nights when you felt like things were normal again, and everybody was out in the community for the same cause and to just get out and have fun. So we ended up offering, adding food trucks and adding different things to these drive-in movies as we went to continue to enhance the experience. Our Rock and Lunch Hour, those were concerts that we started off virtually when we couldn't have them in person, and we put them on Facebook Live, and people tuned in and they got to see Bob the Beachcomber and the different kids acts that were out there. And again, something that we just wanted to help people get away from what was happening in the world and be able to have some fun and engage. Happy Hour was a brand new event that we had come up with, and we have a few brand new events that we're going to go over as well. But this was our first really dog-friendly event, I suppose, that we were focused on dogs and dog vendors, and we had, I think it was about 15 dog vendors that were out there, and we encouraged folks to come out and grab a bite to eat and take a seat and have your dog interact with one another and join in on the puppy parade. And again, was so much fun to see. And people again were just were happy to have something that they could go to. And this was a year in which you didn't get as many complaints as you would in a normal year, and people were just appreciative that they had something that they could go to and ways that they could get out and have fun. Halloween Fest on the go, we talked about all the adapting that we have had to do. Normally this is an extremely popular event that is a walking through a trick-or-treat trail with sponsors and volunteers handing out candy, and it's just a ton of fun to see the kids in costumes and such. We switched it to a drive-through event again, in which we went out to Lac Lavon and we decorated the trail. We had sponsors along the trail, and kids got to drive through in their vehicles, and it was almost like it was better than normal event. And again, I keep going back to everybody was so happy to be out there, but that was kind of the name of the game at this point. And then on the right, you see a couple upcoming events that we have coming up. This is just in the next few months or next 3 months that we have. 3 of these are actually brand new events, and Polar Fest was a brand new event last year that will be the second annual one this year. Now again, we continue to adapt these events to whatever the current restrictions are and whatever limitations we have. We put different protocols and procedures in place so that we can safely and effectively offer these programs. Next slide, please. All right, under the three values that have been identified by city staff, I'll just touch on some highlighted points here. But you can see some examples under the innovative, collaboration, and excellence categories and value categories that we have. And some of the ways that the rec department has accomplished tasks in each of these value categories. So a couple that I haven't quite touched on a little bit are the expanding of our food vending opportunities. We talked the last time we gave an update. The commission had some questions about how we get food vending into our parks and how can we expand and make it a little easier for food vendors to be in our parks for not only events but on given days, which this pandemic was a great opportunity to look into that and to be able to put that on paper and get it done and find a way to do it. In which a year in which again we had no seasonal staff to, for example, at Crystal Lake Beach, we didn't have any staff to run the concession stand out there. And this was a year in which our parks were the busiest. John Neeson, our park superintendent, he said, I think he's been here over 20 years, and he said this is the busiest by far he's ever seen the parks. So not having a concession stand on a 85-degree day at Crystal Lake Beach is a little bit of a downer for those that are out there. So we brought in certain vendors and kind of created a schedule or a calendar for all those food vendors and cookie dough vendors that could be out there to offer something for those folks that are out there on a hot day and be able to provide them some ice cream or some lunch that they could sit and enjoy with their friends and family. So that's just one example of how we were able to adapt on the fly, be able to offer something that we wouldn't done on a normal year, and something that we will probably continue to do going forward, given the success and overall welcoming from the community to all of these food vendors in our parks. Moving on to collaboration a little bit. All of the programs and events that we have had, we're always looking to involve the community and involve local businesses and provide them with an opportunity to get out into the community and engage with the community. One of the ways we tried to do that during the times in which small businesses and small local restaurants didn't have the opportunities that they would on a normal year, we tried to get them involved, especially the Burnsville restaurants, and incorporated some gift cards from their restaurants into some certain park finder contests that we had, or a pumpkin carving contest that we just did, which they were extremely happy just to be involved with. So it was nice to show support to the local restaurants and to be able to encourage people to get out and go do curbside pickup or go through a drive-through or whatever it may be. So you can see an example just above that of all the different sponsors and partners that we have partnered with just in the past few months to help enhance our programs and to enhance all the events that we have. Moving on to excellence quickly, ensuring safety in all of our offerings was the number one priority during the pandemic and during this past summer. We wanted to make sure that everybody was aware of everything that was going on and making sure that they knew we were going through the steps that we needed to make sure that everybody was safe and that it wasn't a risk to bring everybody out into the community. One of the being on the edge of programming with the drive-in, going back to the drive-in movies, we had representatives from multiple communities asking us how we were able to do this and where did the idea come from and what worked and what didn't work, and I believe that led to other communities going out there and putting on their own programs for their own community. So it was nice to be able to be on the leading edge and to expand on our knowledge and our experiences that we had. I believe that is it for me.
Yep. Thank you.
You're up.
Thank you, Scott. I'll just quick introduce myself. I'm David Erdahl. I'm also recreation programmer. I mainly oversee all the youth and family programs, special events, and like Scott said, I'm a part-time mower now and hopping around and helping out at the ice center doing Zamboni stuff. But that's me. So what we had to do over the past 6 months in order to meet the needs of the community is come up with different ways and how we go about offering programs that Scott kind of went over. But so we got to start thinking about virtual programming. Some examples were those virtual concerts that we usually do at Nicollet Commons Park. And then we did start early on in the spring, virtual rec vacation. We would promote just short little videos, clips of us, getting excited about a themed week or getting, kids to get out and do stuff. So we also did, had to think of ideas of how we could, offer resources to people when they're at home. So do-it-yourself recreation was a big one that we offered. Examples of that were the Anyway 5K. They can, do recreation programs that we hype up and offer on their own. We had Spirit Saturdays and Wednesday play. Again, we would, for example, wear your silliest socks on Saturdays, do a little quick video, promote that on our social media pages, and just kind of encourage parents and kids to get involved with those things. Also, safe in-person programming. A huge one that we just did, like Scott mentioned, was the Halloween Fest on the Go. Having them in their cars, passing out candies with gloves and masks, and just making sure that whatever we are doing, in person, we do have a max capacity and have a limit on who can be a part of those things. Flexible park usage, for example, we expanded field use opportunities while we had limited staffing. And also just diverse offerings. I will get to the Crazy Rec 60 that we created here in a little bit, but basically, we came up with a list of anything that we could think of, diverse programs that offered, variety for everyone to kind of reach out to and get involved with. Some safety measures and procedures, program-specific guidelines and procedures. So, we want to comply with the current MNDH and CDC recommendations, all offering or letting our participants know that they have to wear masks, and we do remind them, via email and signage and things like that. A big one is limiting the attendance. Unfortunately, that's something we don't want to do. We're always looking to get as much participation as possible, but during these times, that's something that is very important in order to keep our programs and events safe. So We max our programs out if we have people registering for them. And then a big one, communication and signage, directing people where to go, one-way routes, remaining 6 feet, mask reminders and things like that. So making sure that these are planned out way in advance and making sure that our participants know exactly what to expect when going to a program or event. Our Crazy Rec 60. So this is basically our new innovative recreation program that our department created for fall, winter, and spring. And what we did is we just got together and for 2 to 3 hours and sat down and basically just brainstormed and went around and took turns of just coming up with anything that we could and put it on a list and prioritize them. So questions that we asked, while doing this exercise is, how many people will this serve? How difficult or simple will this be to pursue? Is one thing that we come up with going to take a lot more effort than, a simple, get out there and do it yourself type of program? And how much of the demand is there for this? Will people actually want to, take time and do these things, while being the stay-at-home order? So, and then some categories that we discussed was revenue generating. Do we want this certain thing to be focused on that, or do we want just people to get out there and do stuff? And that's inclusiveness and equity. And then important thing that we kind of discussed was contracted services and getting help from other outside sources to help us and able to put on programs and events that we believe the community will want to get engaged in. So with the hiring freeze of our seasonal workers, there were essential services in our park system that could not be completed or tended to with limited staff. So the 3 main services that we wanted to contract out were the garbage and recycling, restroom cleaning, and mowing services. And since these services were so important to the functionality of our park system, we wanted to contract these out to ensure that our park stayed in the high quality that our public, is accustomed to. So, with there being so much traffic and use of our parks during this time, these services were more necessary than ever, and we got to see that. And having these services contracted out proved to be an extremely important and valuable resource during just the challenging year that we had to go through. And that's that. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, I'm curious, it sounds like there was a real challenge to pull together things that would engage people and get them out and still provide some services. Did you do anything with geocaching or that kind of thing?
We did not this year. That was something that we thought of, and that was definitely on the list that we did create when we all got together. But we had over 60. We probably had a list of 100 different random ideas, and this list is not just going to stop. It's definitely going to continue, and it's just kind of what we want to get to first. And it's a lot of the things that we brainstormed and ideas are definitely going to be coming up in the near future.
What was your idea? What do you think worked best? What were a couple of examples?
Yeah, I honestly think that just the on-the-go events, drive-in events, I think it's different for participants to do. They're used to in-person and things like that have been going on for years. But I think, for example, the Halloween Fest event, because they got to be in their cars, I could tell, the kids were really excited. It was something different that they're not normally used to. And it went very smoothly. And I think with these drive-in events, people feel safe. And there's not as much concern, with kind of the safety with those programs. So I think it was just kind of it was fun and at the same time just kind of relaxing for everyone, knowing that, you know, this is something that we can continue to offer and do in a safe manner. I don't know if you want to jump in with what you thought.
Commissioner Cleveland, I really thought this summer those, the movie night, the drive-in movies were pretty special. I think we had over 100 cars registered for each of the events. And again, people had to stay in their vehicles or with their vehicles, so people weren't intermingling amongst different families or other people in attendance. So therefore, the event was done appropriately. And as Dave said, the drive-in or drive-through Halloween tree trail was phenomenal. It helped that the weather cooperated a great deal on that evening, but we probably could have served more people. We didn't. Guess we didn't figure we were going to be able to handle the volume that we had, but we probably could have done more. So.
Sounds real successful.
Yeah.
Have you guys considered soliciting ideas from residents at all? Were you able to do that at all during the pandemic, when everybody's sitting at home with nothing else to do, then think about what activities they might want to be doing?
Chair Newman, that's a great idea. That is not something that we did this year. We didn't put it out there as such, but at this point, any idea is a good idea. So that's a great idea for our planning for next spring and summer.
Any other questions? And maybe I can just say thank you for getting so creative this summer. I know my kiddos liked some of the different programming, and Superman or Spider-Man and Elsa were hot favorites at our house for a while. So very nice at the
Glad to hear
Halloween
that.
bash. All right, any further questions? Thank you very much. And with that, maybe we'll move on to miscellaneous. Staff, any updates?
Yes, Commissioners, our next meeting is just a few weeks away. We're going to meet on December 7th. Typically, our December meeting is a planning session where we will go ahead and start to plan or think about or talk about the ideas and topics that we want to receive an update on or dig a little deeper into for the coming year. So be prepared to bring your ideas to that meeting on items that you wish to see come before the PNRC. We also had a number of items that we didn't get to this year just because of the pandemic, so a number of things will carry forward, but it'd be great to add a few more things to that list for 2021. Commissioners, tomorrow afternoon at 3:30, MnDOT is holding a virtual public project meeting regarding the 35W bridge overpass and the bike walk trail and lane as part of that bridge. So again, that's 3:30 tomorrow. There's information online, either on the City of Burnsville or through City of Bloomington or through MnDOT. That can help get you to that public meeting. And then on a bit of a down note, Commissioner McGuire sent me an email just this afternoon letting us know that he was going to have to resign from the PNRC just because work has taken over his life in the middle of COVID. So he regrettably had to resign, which is too bad. Right now, our plan is that our council is going to discuss how to replace that commissioner at their December 8th council meeting. So more to come on that.
Thank you for those updates. And I believe we can move forward with a call for an adjournment for tonight's meeting.
So move.
Thank you, Gary. So
Second it.
motion by Gary, second by Dana. All right. Roll call, I believe, for this one as well.
Yes. Commissioner Angara,
Aye.
Commissioner Arnold,
Aye.
Commissioner Cleveland,
Aye.
Commissioner Donaldson, Commissioner Fitchett,
Aye.
Commissioner Newman,
Aye.
and Commissioner Woolman.
Aye.
All right, and the motion passes. Have a good night, everyone, and stay safe.